Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to, I guess, what is now week four. Seems like, at least for me, this is going by very quickly. I don't know if this semester is going by quickly for you as well, but we are progressing along through our very short term together. So, not a whole lot of time left. And because of that, we're already starting to think about the midterm assessment. And so, what I'd like to do tonight is start off by introducing you to the midterm assessment. The midterm assessment is available on our Canvas site. And so I always like to go through the midterm assessment, make sure that everyone is comfortable with the scenarios and the questions that are being asked. And most importantly, that everyone is comfortable with what I'm expecting in terms of your answers to those questions on the midterm assessment. So I'd like to go through the midterm assessment. We'll do that in the very first part of class tonight. Then when we're done with that, then we will turn our attention to our next topic, which is to discuss the size and scope of public administration and pay particular attention to the differences between public and private sector administration. And we're going to draw upon that Graham Allison article from the classics text number 36, which hopefully you had a chance to take a look at. We'll use that kind of as a basis for our discussion. And then that Graham Allison article also will then form the basis for Canvas essay number 3, which you have coming due next week, which looks at, again, the similarities and differences between public and private sector organizations. And then we're going to see how we progress tonight. And I assume we'll probably have time. If we do have time, then we'll work ahead just a little bit and move into a discussion of the discipline of public administration. And we'll talk about public administration as either a field of study or as an academic discipline. We'll talk about some of the characteristics of what makes something an academic discipline, and then kind of give you the information you'll need to help answer one of the scenarios on the midterm assessment, as well as the information you need to then do a good job on discussion board number 4, which is coming due in a couple of weeks. So that's the plan for tonight. So let me just first start out really quickly by showing you the midterm assessment. You can access the midterm assessment in our Canvas site. And so if you just go under the module, I believe it's under module 4, and you'll see a link there for midterm assessment. You click on that link, you can then download the midterm assessment and put your answers directly into that Word file, save it, and then re-upload it into that area. And that's how you'll then be submitting the midterm assessment. And I'll show you that just this in a second. So let's spend a couple minutes talking about the midterm. As I told you in the first night of class, I called an assessment because it's really not an examination. You have 2 weeks to work on this, so it's not due until February 26th. So you have a full 2 weeks, and you can use whatever material you would like to use, whether it be material from what we talk about here on Monday evenings, whether it's material from the Don Kettle textbook, whether it's material from the articles in the classics textbook. All of that information is certainly fair game for you to use in answering these questions. So it's very much an open book type of approach to the midterm assessment. We've got 5 scenarios on the assessment, and then there are 2 questions related to each one of those scenarios. So there's a grand total of 10 questions on the midterm assessment, and a grand total of then 100 points. So 20 points per scenario, 10 points per question, a total of 100 points for the midterm. So let's go through those scenarios and talk about what they are and tell you a little bit about my expectations. Now, each one of these scenarios will deal with a different topic from the class. And so the first scenario deals with that information we covered, the first part of the class, that information we covered in terms of the constitutional basis for public administration. And this first scenario, it's not really as much of a scenario as it is just kind of a statement, but as discussed in class, the Constitution received ratification from the requisite number of states relatively quickly. Oops. However, New York was slow to ratify, and we know that New York was one of the last ones to ratify. You already had 10 states to ratify before you got New York. As we discussed in class, the goal of developing the Bill of Rights and writing the Federalist Papers was to convince the citizens of New York and the anti-federalists to support the new Constitution. The work we currently do as public administrators is directly affected by the liberties and freedoms incorporated in the Bill of Rights. We went through all the amendments of the Constitution. we pay particular attention to those first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights. So in question 1A, select 3 freedoms discussed in the Bill of Rights and discuss how these freedoms affect the work of public administrators. As we had talked about in our first night together, the big question we always ask in this class and all my other classes is, so what? Okay, so we know that we have these rights in the Bill of Rights. Well, so what? What do these rights and liberties then mean for how we do our job as public administrators? So select 3 of those freedoms, whether it be freedom of speech or whichever ones you want to select 3 of those, and then discuss the impact that those have on how we do our work as public administrators. And then in 1B, Madison made a compelling argument for the new Constitution in Federalist Paper number 39. We went through Federalist Paper number 39 and talked about the arguments that Madison made in Federalist 39. We say kind of deconstructed the Constitution into its component elements. Select and discuss 3 arguments made by Madison in Federalist number 39 to convince anti-federalists to support the new Constitution. Now, in terms of your responses to these questions, 1 or 2 paragraphs as a response should be sufficient for all the questions then on the exam. So for each one, 1 to 2 paragraphs should be enough. I'm very interested in the quality, the content of your response, but I'm also interested in you doing it in a very parsimonious way and being as concise as you can be, very similar to the approach that we take then on our Canvas essays. So it's always good in public administration to be as succinct and concise as possible. So that's your constitutional scenario. Then number 2, we actually get into a real scenario. So in this scenario, we have the city of South Terra Verde is a quickly growing community adjacent to a large metropolitan area. South Terra Verde has decided to construct a large public park in the center of town to accommodate the recreation needs of its growing population. The City Council has been discussing this issue for the past 2 months and plans to discuss the purchase of land for this park again at their next council meeting, with a possible vote on the purchase also scheduled for this meeting. Council member Hayes recently, as of last week, purchased a tract of land within the area for the proposed city park. Council member Hayes plans to participate in the discussion and vote on the city's purchase of the land for the park. So this is obviously your ethics and accountability scenario. In 2A, if Mr. Hayes participates in the discussion and votes on the proposed land purchase, what principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics would this potentially violate and why? So we went through those 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics. So just tell me, which of those principles do you think this action on the part of Councilmember Hayes may potentially violate and why? And then in 2B, are you concerned about Mr. Hayes' purchase of the land? Why or why not? So that's your ethics and accountability scenario. Then in scenario 3, we get into public-private distinctions. So a lot of the information we'll cover in the lion's share of class tonight will then help you then with this scenario number 3. So in number 3, we have the Midtown Unified School District has seen its student population increase by 40% over the past 2 years. This growth is forecast to continue for the next 10 years due to development within the city's jurisdiction. Faced with this exponential growth in student population, the district needs to construct new schools quickly. The district decides to construct a school on the east side of the city by funding the school with bonds, which means borrowing money. So if you're not familiar with the way in which local governments raise money for capital projects, they oftentimes do it through issuing these things called bonds. Bonds are long-term debt mechanisms. And so investors will purchase those bonds, and then the proceeds the government gets from the money that investors use to purchase the bonds, that is the money that is then used to construct these schools and these other large capital projects. So they're borrowing money to do it. The construction costs for this school are estimated to be $65 million, and construction should take 18 months. The district also entered into an agreement with a developer to construct another school on the western edge of the city. The school will be completely built by the developer with little to no district interaction. So this is going to be completely built by this private sector developer. This school will be identical to the school to the east. So they're identical floor plans, identical blueprints. and is estimated to cost $45 million and to take 12 months to complete. And those costs of $45 million for the privately constructed school and $65 million for the publicly constructed school, those are reasonable estimates that are actually kind of on the lower end. When I was on the board, we opened a new school, and the new school was a two-story school would accommodate about 1,000 students. And that school costs about $55 million to construct. And that was about 9, 10 years ago. And so I'm sure with cost escalation, those costs have gone up even more than what's represented for you in this scenario. So you got a private sector corporation, a private sector entity, a developer building a school, and then the local school district building a school. 3A, what explains the discrepancy in the time to completion and the cost between the two schools? And then 3B, what are some of the disadvantages to allowing a private sector developer to construct the school on the west side of the city? So what are some of the disadvantages of having this school constructed by a private sector developer? Again, we'll get into this discussion tonight about differences between public and private sectors and why sometimes the private sector is able to do things more quickly and at a lower cost than their public sector counterparts. We'll talk about briefly about things such as public contract code and the way in which public entities have to go out to bid for projects. And that's something that private sector corporations don't necessarily need to do. Especially when you're talking about a developer that's in the business of constructing buildings. This is something they do on a daily basis, and so they don't have the same need to go out there and contract with contractors and subcontractors. This is something they can oftentimes do very much in-house. Then scenario number 4, and at the later part of class tonight, we'll get into this information as well. But as we know, Woodrow Wilson's classic article, The Study of Administration, which you'll be reading for next week, formed the basis for a separate field of the study of administration. One of the enduring concepts that emerged from the article was this idea of a politics administration dichotomy. We mentioned the politics administration dichotomy in Wilson's article, where he talked about accountability and ethics. We're going to talk about that again tonight in the last part of class, and we'll talk again about why a politics administration dichotomy, and then also why a politics administration dichotomy is not really as accurate and as accepted today as perhaps it was back in 1887 when Wilson first presented it. So in question 4A, describe Wilson's argument for why we need a separate study of public administration. And then in 4B, describe the politics administration dichotomy and why this dichotomy is no longer as valid as it once may have been. So we'll be using information from what we've talked about tonight, as well as your reading of the Woodrow Wilson article, then to answer that question. And then your fifth and final scenario gets us that information that we are not going to cover until next week. So as of tonight, the end of tonight, you should have all the information you need to do the first 4 scenarios. Information for scenario 5 will be presented next week. The Department of Housing in the city of Tyler Heights is a large, old organization in the state of New Mexico. Its primary function is to make adequate and affordable housing available to income-eligible residents in the city. As an older organization, the Department of Housing has developed an extensive set of policies and procedures. Employees are held accountable and evaluated based upon how closely they adhere to these policies and procedures. Employee turnover is high as employees feel that they are not valued and have few opportunities to develop their skills through training. There is little vertical and horizontal communication occurring in the organization. So in question 5A, select 2 classical organization theorists or theories that you feel would benefit the organization. Discuss these theories and why they would benefit the organization. And that's information we'll cover next week. Then in 5B, select 2 neoclassical organization theorists or theories that you feel would benefit the organization and discuss the theories and why you think they would be beneficial. So all that information you'll get next week as we talk about the theoretical perspectives that have been developed within public administration, within, I guess if you want to call it a discipline or a field of study, within the discipline or field of study of public administration. So that you'll get next week. So those are the 5 scenarios. 2 questions related to each of the scenarios. Again, concise answers, 1 to 2 paragraphs for each one of the answers would certainly be enough to suffice. Any general questions about the midterm assessments? The scenarios on the assessment, they're original scenarios, and so they're scenarios I've written, so you're not going to find them floating around the internet or anything. They're new scenarios that I wrote for this semester, so all brand new, original. That's why you don't see any citations there, because I didn't pull them from anywhere I wrote them. So no need for citations there. And also in terms of citations for your answers, I'm not requiring you to use outside resources. I'm not requiring you to put citations. If you use the information from the class, we're going to consider that to be common knowledge, much like with your Canvas essays, so you don't have to worry about citing things in APA for the midterm assessment. Let me very quickly, and you've probably already seen where the midterm assessment is, but let me share my screen and then we'll jump into the Canvas site and I'll show you where you locate it. Email, we need the course site. Okay, so here is our 500 Canvas site, and it's in student view, so hopefully it looks a lot like what you see, with the exception of the purple at the bottom. That just tells me I'm now in student view. If you just click on modules, just like you would to get the information for each week, and then once you're in modules, you just scroll down until you get to, let's see, which module is it in? I think I put it in, it's actually, the link is in module 5, right here. Oh, no, just missed it, right down here. And so if you just click on that link, then it will take you to the submission area. Here is the file, so you can just click the arrow, download the file. And I do recommend, it's probably easier for you, download the file, it's a Word file, and then just put your answers directly into that file. And so after each question, just type your answer directly into the file. If you would like, you can put your answers in a different font color to kind of separate it from the normal color of the answer of the question. So a lot of people like to put their answers in red or blue or whatever color you like, and just put your answers directly in there. Then you resave the file. I don't really have any naming conventions for the file, so you can name the file anything that you're comfortable naming it. And then when you're ready to submit, just click on the upload button, and you're then able to attach it, and off it goes into the Dropbox, and then I will review it and grade it. So that's how the midterm assessment is going to work. Okay. So that's the midterm. Again, I just think I know we take up a little bit of time in class going through it, but I think it's good that we're all on the same page in terms of what we're doing and what the expectations are before you start working away on that midterm. That midterm, again, then is due in 2 weeks. So it's due on February 26th by midnight on that day. As you're working on the midterm assessment, if you have any questions about it, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. There are no real right or wrong answers on the assessment. The assessment will be evaluated based on your ability to justify your answers. And just like everything else in public administration, we're not looking for the best answer, we're looking for the most appropriate answer. And so there can be multiple ways of answering these questions. As long as you defend your approach and give a good justification, then that is really all that I am looking for. Let's see, Shauna's clarification, answer the questions just need to be 1 to 2 paragraphs, no need for citations. Exactly. Yeah, 1 to 2 paragraphs is certainly sufficient, and you don't have to worry about citing outside sources. I really look at it as being very much an assessment tool to kind of assess how you have learned the information that's been presented in class. So it's not a research type of assignment, it's an assessment assignment for what you have learned in the class. Now, if you feel your answers need to be longer than 1 or 2 paragraphs, that's fine as well. Put whatever you need to put in there is okay. I'm not going to stop reading at 2 paragraphs. I just do ask that you try and make it as concise and parsimonious as you possibly can. I learned that lesson the very, very hard way when my undergrad was in political science and in history. And, historians like to write, and they like to really elaborate on things and use a lot of flowery language. And so when I first started graduate work in public administration, the first paper, if you want to call it the paper that I wrote, was about 80 pages. And I was very proud of it. First semester doctoral student, went out there and I got it bound at the local FedEx or Kinko's or whatever was in town, and turned in this kind of like looked like a bound thesis. And the comment I got at the end is that, this isn't history, that you should be more parsimonious and be more concise. And I had like red marks all over it that, this is not necessary. This is not necessary. And I kind of learned the hard way that in public administration, we are a lot more concise and parsimonious than in some other academic disciplines. So it's always good to hone your skills of parsimony, if you will, while you're here in the MPA program. Okay, let's get into our primary topic for tonight, which is a discussion of some of the differences between public and private administration. And this will form the basis not only for scenario 3 on the midterm assessment, but it'll also form the basis for Canvas essay number 3, which is coming due next Monday on February 19th. In that Canvas essay, what you'll be doing is you'll be comparing a public versus a private organization. So I think in the prompt, I say, pick your organization. Well, you don't have to use your organization if you're not currently working in an organization. Pick an organization, the public sector that you are interested in or that you are familiar with. If you're working in a private organization, you can use a private organization as the basis for your response. But take an organization, whether it's public or private, and then compare it to an organization in the other sector. So if you're looking at a public organization, compare it to a private organization. If you're working in a private organization, compare it to a public or perhaps even a nonprofit organization. If you're working in a nonprofit organization, compare it to either a public or a private organization. You kind of have a choice there. But what I'm asking you in that prompt to do is to, in comparing those organizations, highlight 2 similarities between those organizations and then 2 differences between those organizations as well. So it all builds off of the Graham Allison article and what we're going to be discussing here this evening. And that's Canvas essay number 3. So after tonight, we'll have the information for Canvas essay 3 as well as scenario 3 on the midterm assessment. One thing we do know about public administration, and you'll notice as we are moving through each week in this class, we're continuing to build on this idea of what is public administration and whether public administration is an academic discipline. But one thing we do know about public administration is that public administration is immense. That public administration deals with government, and government touches just about every aspect of the lives of ordinary average citizens. If you think about things such as when you get up in the morning, the foods you eat for breakfast, the quality of that food, the safety of that food is regulated by government. Your car that you drive to work is going to be regulated by government in terms of fuel emissions, in terms of safety requirements with airbags and all those other good things to make cars safer. The road you drive on is probably going to be a public road that was paved with taxpayer dollars. Just about every aspect of our lives is going to be touched in one way or another by government and therefore public administration. We truly encounter public administration and government every single place that we go on a daily basis. Because of that, what happens is that when people are always encountering government and bureaucracy, they form an opinion about government and bureaucracy, and it really generates a lot of debate about the effectiveness and efficiency of government and bureaucracy. And the problem for that, as Charles Goodsell told us back several decades ago in his book, The Case for the Bureaucracy, Goodsell made the argument that people tend to have a very negative view of the bureaucracy and of government. And Goodsell will argue one of the reasons why people have such a negative view of the bureaucracy and of government is because of their last interaction with an organization. That they may have had 99 good, satisfying interactions, but if they have one bad interaction with a government agency, that is then going to form a negative opinion about the bureaucracy. So whenever I use the word bureaucracy, what do you think of? What are some of the connotations associated with the word bureaucracy? So I say, we'll do some free association. I say bureaucracy, what do you think of? So bureaucracy. What do you think of when you think of the word bureaucracy? Are they positive thoughts? Are they negative thoughts? As always, you can use your microphone, you can use text chat, whatever you're comfortable using to participate. But what do you think of with bureaucracy? Neutral decisions, as Caitlin says. Yeah, I mean, in the bureaucracy, what we're trying to do is we're trying to treat people equally. We're trying to protect individual rights. And so oftentimes we try and be as objective and as neutral as we are in terms of making decisions and dealing with citizens who we come into contact with. And so, yeah, you hope the organizations are not biased. You hope that they're very objective and very fair in the way in which they deal with consumers or citizens or however you want to term the people that these organizations come into contact with. So I would agree with you. Neutral decisions. That's a positive thing. And that's hopefully a good thing. But sometimes in trying to maintain individual rights and trying to treat people fairly, we have to adhere to rules and regulations. Adhering to rules and regulations, when those rules and regulations do not contribute to what someone wants to get out of their interactions with an organization, that can be viewed very negatively. And so sometimes rules and regulations are good because they allow us to treat people fairly. Sometimes rules and regulations are bad in that they end up being associated with what we refer to as the dreaded red tape. And oftentimes when we talk about bureaucracies, we talk about a lot of red tape. That these organizations have so many rules, they have so many regulations that they just trying to adhere to these rules and regulations above and beyond trying to service the citizens they come into contact with. I just switched my camera off just in case. I don't want to have any bandwidth connectivity issues. And so I'm not being rude. I'm just trying to save some bandwidth. So red tape is usually a very negative association with the bureaucracy. When you have a lot of red tape, then you end up slowing things down. And so a lot of red tape also then tends to mean inefficiency and ineffectiveness. And those are negative terms that are also associated with bureaucratic organizations. One of the problems for organizations is sometimes as bureaucratic organizations age, they tend to get larger and larger. And as they get larger, they develop more rules and regulations, which just kind of makes sense because the older they get, the more institutional memory there is, the more they have dealt with people, the more they have run into different types of situations. And so, since they've run into all these different situations, they've probably written rules and regulations to govern all those situations that they have encountered. And so, you really have this proliferation of rules and regulations. With a proliferation of rules and regulations, you can end up getting what Robert Merton refers to as a bureaucratic dysfunction. One of the main dysfunctions of a bureaucracy is when an organization prioritizes adhering to rules and regulations over meeting the needs of their citizens. So when carrying out these rules and regulations becomes the goal of the organization, that's what Merton refers to as goal displacement. And that's what then leads to that type of bureaucratic dysfunction. So I do think we have kind of that red tape association, somewhat of an impersonal type of association as well, where people really don't care that much about the citizens that they are dealing with. They just want to abide by the rules and regulations that they're being held accountable for. So Goodsell tells us that people tend to have a very negative view of the bureaucracy. So let's kind of drill down into this term bureaucracy and what bureaucracy really means, because at its heart, public administration is the study of public bureaucracy. So what do we mean by public bureaucracy? A public bureaucracy refers to public organizations. So at the very heart of public administration is the study of these public organizations. And these public organizations, these public bureaucracies, are a formal, rational system of relationships among people vested with administrative authority to carry out public programs. Now, that's a very long winded definition. So let's go back and kind of chop it up into its component elements. So, a public bureaucracy refers to a public organization which is a formal, rational system of relations. It's formal and it is rational. Public organizations are formal in that they have position classification systems. They have position descriptions, they have position titles. Each one of those positions will then have certain jobs, what we call the division of labor and specialization of tasks. So there'll be certain jobs that people in those different positions will be doing. All those jobs and how they should be done, all that is written down. So it's very much of a formal, documented type of system. And it's supposed to be a very rational system. It's supposed to make sense. So this person reports to the person above them, who reports to the person above them, who reports to the person above them. In public administration, that's what's referred to as a scalar chain. And we'll talk more about that next week when we talk about theories, but that's a scalar chain, and that everyone knows to whom they are responsible within the structure of the organization. So it's a very formal, rational system of these relationships among persons who are vested with administrative authority. That's an important part of the definition. They are vested with administrative authority. They have this legal authority by virtue of being in a government organization. This is one of the big differences between a public and private organization. Public organizations have this legal standing, they have this formal authority. This formal authority provides them with coercive power. You think about a government and the definitions of what is a government. How do you know that something is a government if you come into contact with it? All governments tend to share two primary characteristics. The first characteristic is that government has control over a jurisdiction. It has control over a certain geographic area. So, California has control over the boundaries of California, the state of California. So that's one characteristic. The second characteristic of a government is coercive power. Governments have the ability to coerce residents to take actions they otherwise would not take. Should sound familiar because that's our definition of power. So they have this coercive authority, this coercive power. Things such as making people register for the selective service before they are allowed to get federal financial aid. Things such as forcing people to pay taxes. Things such as forcing people to serve on juries so we can abide by the jury provisions that we have incorporated in the Bill of Rights. So these are all coercive powers that government has. This is all authority that governments have that oftentimes private corporations do not. So these are bureaucrats, these are people who are vested with this administrative authority. And then to what purpose? For the purpose of carrying out these public programs. So I think it's a pretty good basic definition of what we consider to be a bureaucracy. And the study of bureaucracy very much is what we mean by public administration. Now, the problem is when people have this very negative view of the bureaucracy, they tend to think that bureaucracies are too inefficient to accomplish much of anything of value. But at the same time, people think that bureaucracies are made up of very efficient and sometimes abusers and users of power, that they're not very efficient at doing things to benefit the public, but they don't have a lot of trust in their motivations of these members of bureaucratic organizations, that they view them not only as being inefficient in carrying out things that would benefit society, but that they can actually be very efficient when it comes time to abusing their power. So I think there's very little doubt that public bureaucracies, public organizations have a pretty low percentage, if you will, when you look at those public opinion polls about how much people trust bureaucratic organizations. That's a pretty low percentage. May not be as low as Congress, which is usually either in the teens or sometimes even the single digits, but it's pretty low. And so we have this uphill battle we have to fight in terms of being bureaucrats. Going back to Charles Goodsell and his case for the bureaucracy, he argued that in order to try and combat this negative view of the bureaucracy, what bureaucrats need to do is they need to be proactive in showing people just how important government is to the daily lives, their individual daily lives. It's kind of similar to this whole idea of the Bennington and Moore article of adding public value. So public bureaucrats, public managers need to add that public value and then demonstrate to citizens what that public value is and how important it is for what these organizations do on a daily basis. One of the things that public administration as a field of study has suffered from in recent years is they really suffer from this crisis of identity, where they have worked very hard to distinguish themselves from private administration. You are all, well, most of you are getting an MPA, a Master's of Public Administration. Maybe when you told family and friends, I'm going to enroll in an MPA program, some people may have thought they heard MBA and thought you were in a Master's of Business Administration program. We've really had to try and show why there's a separation between the study of private administration versus the study of public administration. There are some distinct differences, and we'll talk about those and flesh those out a little bit more in the next few slides. But just for our purposes now, a couple of the main differences between public and private administration is, number one, what we had just said, this role of public authority. The public organizations, as government organizations, they come into existence through enabling legislation that is passed by governmental bodies like Congress or state legislature. As such, when they are created, they carry with them this legal authority, this coercive power. That's something that public organizations have that private organizations oftentimes do not have. So that's one main distinction. Second main distinction is that the characteristic organizational processes that go on in public organizations operate somewhat different than what we see in private organizations. And we're going to delve into that much deeper when we get into the Graham Allison article. Another distinction between public and private administration is that in the public sector, public administrators engage in both policy formulation as well as implementation and execution. So when you move on and take the 670 policy analysis class, you will talk about the policy process. And in talking about the policy process, you'll talk about different phases of policy, such as policy formulation, policy implementation, execution, policy evaluation. In the public sector, public administrators have a role to play in both policy formulation as well as policy implementation. They advise elected officials when those elected officials are putting those policies together. Oftentimes, they'll actually write parts of those policies and those pieces of legislation that will eventually be passed by those legislative bodies. So they are very much involved in formulation, and then they are primarily responsible for the implementation of those policies once passed by a legislative body. Now, in the private sector, private organizations are also involved in policy implementation. You think about government regulations, and those government regulations that will regulate the work of a private corporation, those private corporations are the ones who are responsible for carrying out those regulations. And so they are very much involved in policy implementation. They are much less involved, though, when it comes to policy formulation. Yes, they can lobby members of the state legislature. Yes, they can lobby members of Congress, but they are not as intricately involved in the creation, the formulation of those policies as their public sector counterparts. So public organizations are involved in both formulation and implementation, whereas private organizations are more involved in implementation than they certainly are in formulation. Here's another good way at looking at some of the differences between public and private organizations, and that is this federal law known as the Federal Anti-Deficiency Act. The Federal Anti-Deficiency Act forbids government officials from spending on anything that is not explicitly authorized by law. So we can only spend money on things that have been authorized by a legislative body, by Congress, or by a state legislature. By contrast, private organizations can spend on pretty much anything that they want to, as long as it's not forbidden by law. So what we spend on needs to be granted, it needs to be provided for in law. What private organizations can spend on is pretty much anything as long as it's not forbidden by law, by policy and rules and regulations. That really does underscore a major difference between the two sectors. This Anti-Deficiency Act was something that became very prominent in the Trump administration when we had the government shutdown. If you remember, a few years back in the Trump administration, there was a government shutdown because Congress could not come to agreement on a federal budget. So whenever we have a government shutdown, it's always what we call a partial government shutdown. in that all of the appropriation bills that have not yet been passed, all of those organizations that are funded by those unapproved appropriation bills, they are then subject to a government shutdown, which means that people who work in those agencies are furloughed and they're told if you're not an essential employee, you need to stay home. And that's a partial government shutdown. The problem was in this last government shutdown, the Trump administration, it was on the heels of the passage of this piece of legislation called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I always get the name wrong, but the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was a huge change to the way in which the federal income tax structure worked. And it was arguably the biggest change to the federal income tax since the Tax Reform Act in 1986. And so there are a lot of new provisions in federal tax law in terms of how you file your taxes and deductions and exemptions and all those types of things. And there are a lot of new provisions. People were confused because they were going into tax season. They wanted to get clarification on what they qualified for, what they didn't qualify for. So they then started calling the IRS hotline, the customer service line. Well, nobody was answering. And nobody was answering because all those people who used to do customer service at the IRS, they had all been furloughed as part of this government shutdown. What the Trump administration wanted to do is they wanted to bring these people back to work to answer these calls and to respond to taxpayer requests. But the problem was there wasn't money to pay them because their salaries, that bill had not yet been passed by Congress. So that appropriation bill had not been approved. And so the Trump administration was forbidden from bringing these people back to work and paying them because there was no authority to pay those individuals. That's an example of this Anti-Deficiency Act at work. And so we do see some good examples of the Anti-Deficiency Act here and there in our recent history. But that's a big difference between the sectors. We can only spend on what we're authorized to spend on. The private sector can spend on just about anything it wants, as long as it's not forbidden by laws, rules, or regulations. Which then leads us into the Graham Allison article. And I think that we really want to delve into these differences between public and private sector organizations. I think the Graham Allison article is very instructive in allowing us to do that. And this Graham Allison article, Public and Private Management, Are They Fundamentally Alike in All Unimportant Respects, is one of the most important articles with this discussion of differences between public and private organizations. And I hope you had a chance to take a look at it. And we're not going to go through the entire article, obviously. There's a lot here. But what I do want to do is kind of really drill down into what are some of the similarities and what are some of the differences that Allison tells us between public and private organizations. So let's start with some of the similarities. So according to Allison, what are some of the similarities between public and private sectors? What do they do that is similar in nature? What are some of their similarities? If you want to put this in a more specific context, think about organizations. And so think about a public organization and compare that to a corollary organization in the private sector. And what do all organizations do, regardless of what sector they are located in? If you're going to run an organization, what do you need in order to run an organization? Since we're all here at Cal State Long Beach, we can think about what do we need to run a public university versus a private university? So Cal State Long Beach versus a USC. What do both of those organizations need? You got to have money, right? You can't run an organization unless you have money to pay for that organization. You got to pay salaries, you got to pay benefits, you have to pay for leases and the offices that you are leasing. You have to pay for your daily supplies, office supplies, transportation, fleets of vehicles. All those types of things are going to cost money. So every organization, regardless of its sector, has to generate money and then figure out how to spend that money. So budgeting is similar, that both organizations have to engage in some aspect of budgeting. Well, if they're using that money to pay for their employees, obviously they have to engage in staffing as well. you have to be able to hire people with the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job and hire those people into your organization, regardless if you're in the public or in the private sector. So, staffing, personnel, every organization has to engage in that. All organizations engage in strategic planning, public and private sector. So we put together a strategic plan, we articulate our goals and objectives, we put together a timetable for the achievement of those goals and those objectives. Every organization has to engage in that. If you've got a large organization, you're certainly going to place a premium on coordination. You want to coordinate all the efforts and everything that's going on within those organizations in order to help you achieve your goals and your objectives. So there's a lot of coordination that goes on, regardless of sector. Reporting. You have to report on how well you are accomplishing your goals. In the private sector, you're going to report to your stakeholders, your shareholders, how well you're accomplishing your goals. In the public sector, you're going to report to your overseers, whether it be a state legislature or Congress or some element, some organization, the executive branch. We all have to produce these reports and submit these reports. We have to do a good job of organizing our organizations so that we know what everyone is responsible for and everyone knows to whom they are accountable. So we have to have organization charts built into both of our organizations. This idea that all organizations, regardless of sector, have to engage in planning, they have to engage in organizing, they have to engage in staffing. They also have to engage in directing, where the leaders of the organization have to direct how work is to be done. They have to engage in coordination. They have to engage in reporting. They have to engage in budgeting. All these different functions of administration have come to be known as POSCORP. So it's just this kind of strange acronym known as POSCORP. POSCORP: planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. All organizations engage in those functions. So if you're looking at what's similar between public and private organizations, that's your primary similarity, according to Allison. They engage in all these aspects of POSCORP. The difference between public and private organizations is not necessarily in what they do, but rather in how they do it. So how you do planning, how you do staffing, how you do reporting, how you do budgeting in the public sector is going to be fundamentally different than how you do it in the private sector. So when it comes to the differences, it's not so much a difference in what we are doing, but rather it's a difference in how we go about doing it. So let's compare the how of the differences between public and private organizations. So we said that both organizations have to staff their organizations. They have to hire people, they have to train those folks, they have to allocate work, they have to evaluate the performance of those individuals and evaluate jobs. They then have to provide training and development to remedy some inadequate performance if it exists. And then they have to decide how they're going to sanction and discipline and sometimes even promote their employees. So in both the public and private sector, when it comes to personnel, we're kind of going through the same types of functions. The difference is, again, how we do it. So you think about recruitment between a private organization and a public organization. When you go out there and you recruit in the public sector, you're oftentimes really working toward getting the most diverse workforce that you can get for the purposes of social equity, social justice, and representative bureaucracy. So in recruiting, we're oftentimes doing targeted recruiting, where we are recruiting in a targeted way to members of underrepresented populations to try and get a more diverse workforce. So the way in which we recruit is probably going to be a little bit different. And just to not belabor the point too much, but here in a public university like Cal State Long Beach, whenever we go out to hire a faculty member or a staff member, the position vacancy announcement, whenever we write that up, that has to be approved not just at the department, the college level, but it also has to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. Then we also have to put together a recruitment plan. And that recruitment plan, we have to specify where that notice is going out, what types of newspapers or online sources or organizations are we sending that recruitment letter out to, and we're saying that vacancy announcement out to. That recruitment plan then also has to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. Whenever we get our pool of applicants, we then have to certify those applicants that yes, they all meet the requirements for the job. And then that initial pool has to be approved by not only us in the college, but also by the Office of Equity and Diversity. Then as we go through that approved pool, then as we identify the semifinalists, people who will be given a Zoom interview or a phone interview, that pool must be approved by Equity and Diversity. And as we narrow that pool down to usually 3 candidates who we invite to campus for an on-campus interview, that final pool of candidates must also then be approved by Equity and Diversity. So we go through a lot of steps as a public university that a lot of private universities do not need to go through in terms of their recruitment. In terms of selection, that's also different. We are in an era of merit, so we select employees who work in a public organization. We are selecting them based upon their qualifications. So we're going to look at their knowledge, skills, and abilities as represented by their application, by their resume, by their education background, by their recommendations from former supervisors or professors. So we are going to hire people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities, and we need to prove that the people we are hiring are being hired based upon their merit. They're not being hired because they knew someone on the hiring committee or because they had a relative who was working at the university or in the public organization. So again, we have to really go through our due process and our due diligence in hiring people to work in public organizations. That's why I don't know if you're working in a public organization currently, you may have witnessed this in your recruitment, in that perhaps it took 3 months or 6 months in order for you to get this public position, as opposed to getting a position the same day in a private sector organization. Go to a private corporation, you go in, you interview, and you can be hired immediately on the spot. And if HR gets all your paperwork processed in time, you could start perhaps the next morning. It doesn't work that way in the public sector. There are a lot more steps you have to go through in bringing people into the organization. Same type of thing occurs once someone's hired into the organization. So in a public organization, you will get a position classification for your position. That position classification will then dictate the amount of compensation that you will get for your position. You then will get a position description that describes the types of work you're doing on a daily basis, the amount of time you are spending on all those different functions. You then will be evaluated based upon your performance, and then any types of sanctions or discipline will have to be tied directly to your performance in the job. As public employees, we are career civil servants. I know last week Kelly talked to you a bit about civil service. We are career civil service, which means we have career civil service protections built into the law. We are protected from being fired or disciplined based upon political reasons. So we can't be fired or disciplined because we belong to the quote unquote wrong political party or that we supported the losing political candidate. We have to get our job actions based upon our performance in the job. So we are career civil servants in the public sector. In the private sector, most employees are what we call at-will employees. So they serve at the will of the organization. So as long as the organization is not acting in a discriminatory manner, the organization can fire people and can sanction, discipline people much, much easier and much quicker without much documentation at all as compared to the public sector. As we talk later on in the course about the management of human resources, we'll talk a lot about the need for documentation and how you always have to document any subpar performance and then document ongoing efforts in training and development to mitigate that poor performance. So the entire human resource process, the way in which it's done, is different in the public sector as compared to the private sector because of employing career civil servants. The measurement of performance is different between public and private sector. Both sectors measure their performance. How they measure their performance is obviously different. How you measure performance in the private sector is oftentimes much more straightforward. It's much more quantitative and empirical. how much of a good did you sell? What is your profit margin? That's what's your return on investment. Those are all pretty quantitative measures of performance in the private sector. In the public sector, when you are trying to improve someone's quality of life, obviously that's much less quantitative in nature. So it's more difficult to measure performance in the public sector. In the public sector, because we serve these many masters, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, it means that we have these competing standards that we are held to. We have standards of and expectations from the legislature, from the executive, from the judicial, as well as from national, state, and local levels of government. So a lot more competing standards and expectations. Obviously, in the public sector, we work in a fishbowl. And so there's a lot more public scrutiny over what we do in the public sector as compared to in the private sector. And rightly so, because we are dealing with public taxpayer money. We are working in public organizations. In the public sector, leaders and managers oftentimes don't have the same formal authority over their employees as you would see in a private sector organization. If you are dealing in the private sector with an at-will employee, you have a lot of control over that employee because that employee knows that their job is based upon whether or not they do what you are telling them to do. In the public sector, leaders and managers lead much more by persuasion as opposed to just top-down direct ordering someone to do something. There's a very famous situation where at the end of the Truman administration, when Dwight David Eisenhower was elected president, Truman was very famous for saying that Eisenhower would end up being the most frustrated person in Washington, D.C., because Eisenhower came from the military. And so Eisenhower is used to telling people, jump, and they jump. He had that authority that came from his rank. As a president, you don't really have that. As a president, yes, it's a very powerful position. Yes, it's the only nationally elected position in the entire country, but you have to lead through persuasion. And that's true for a lot of our managers in our public agencies. If you have career civil servants that you are managing who are there for a career, they oftentimes will say, well, I'm just going to wait you out. I don't like what you're asking me to do. And so therefore, I'm going to just wait until you're gone. Because chances are you'll be gone in 18 or 24 or 36 months. I'm here for 30 or 40 years. And so instead of telling them you have to do this, instead you have to lead through persuasion. Not only do you have career civil service regulations that you have to deal with as a public manager, but you also have oftentimes unionized employees. Those unionized employees will have a collective bargaining agreement. That collective bargaining agreement, that contract, will stipulate a lot of the ways in which you are going to manage your employees. It will stipulate how people are hired. It will stipulate how people, their conditions of work, how you change those conditions of work. It will stipulate the evaluation process. It will stipulate the discipline process. It will stipulate how you get training and development opportunities. So you not only have all these career civil service regulations, but overlaid on top of that, you then also have this contract, this collective bargaining agreement, which means that you work under a lot more regulations. You have to use a lot more persuasion. And then obviously, as we've said before, in the public sector, you have a lot more oversight horizontally from branches of government, oversight vertically from different levels of government as well. And just to add in here, we had already talked about budgeting and that you need money regardless of your sector, but where that money comes from makes a difference. As we talked about when we talked about accountability and ethics, most government agencies will get the majority of their funding from appropriations, legal appropriations, which are very stable, much more incremental in nature. In the private sector, you get your revenue from profits, which is much more dynamic, much more variable. You can't really count on those profits from one year to the next like you can count on legal appropriations. And we talked about that last week in terms of why sometimes we say there's more of a premium on efficiency in the private sector as compared to the public sector. So again, when you kind of wrap up the Graham Allison article, I think that it's a really compelling argument. And it goes, right back to the title of the article, where it basically answers this question in that, yes, public and private management, they are fundamentally alike, but they are alike in what they do and not how they do it. And so they are fundamentally alike in some relatively unimportant respects, in that this is what all organizations do. These are the functions of every organization. What really matters is the differences in how these functions are done between public and private sector organizations. Our natural response whenever we're asked what's the difference between a public and a private organization is to go directly for profit and to go directly for that bottom line. Well, private sector corporations, they have this profit motive, they have this bottom line, whereby the vast majority of public organizations do not have a profit motive, they do not have a bottom line. Now, some do, and there's a small subset of public organizations, for example, government corporations. Government corporations like the US Postal Service are allowed to run a profit. The Postal Service doesn't, but it's at least in theory allowed to run a profit. That's why it's called a government corporation. But the vast majority of government organizations do not run for a profit. They are inherently nonprofit types of organizations. I think that this distinction of private sector has profit motivation and public sector does not. I think this is a classic example of what is a necessary but not yet sufficient distinction. It is a necessary distinction, but it alone is not sufficient for distinguishing between the two sectors. Because again, you can have some public organizations as government corporations that do operate to make a profit. You can then also have private non-governmental organizations such as nonprofits who do not operate to make a profit. They operate to advance the social agenda. So you can have different permutations of organizations that kind of cross that profit line. So the lack of a bottom line is a necessary but not sufficient difference between the two sectors. I think what really does kind of underscore the difference between the two sectors is what we had discussed before in terms of this distinction between policy formulation and policy implementation execution. And I use the terms implementation execution kind of interchangeably. So we know that public and private organizations both engage in policy implementation, but it's really those public organizations that are much more involved in policy formulation. They really contribute much more toward the policy formulation process. So when we're talking policy execution, policy implementation, we're talking about executing laws. So we're talking about the task of public administration in translating written law into action. These laws, as we have said before, when they are passed by an elected body, they oftentimes are passed in relatively vague and ambiguous terms in order to get a majority to agree. More details mean more opposition. So when these vague laws come out of Congress, they then have to go to these agencies, and agencies then have to write the rules and regulations to help dictate how these policies will be implemented. So there's a lot of decision making among public administrators and public organizations in the policy execution process. But there's also a heightened role for these managers and leaders to play in policy formation as well. In policy formulation, they're involved in terms of before the policy is made, they have the job of advising officials. So they provide advice, sometimes actually write some of the language that will end up in these policies and these laws. And then after a policy is made, they have the responsibility for making sense of it. When you are writing these rules and regulations in the implementation phase, by writing those rules and regulations, you are also formulating policy as well. So this is this bleed over between formulation and execution that we see in public organizations. And this is why it is so difficult for us to say, well, formulation happens over here, execution happens over here, and never the two shall meet. It's really very much of an overlap between those two processes, and public administrators are involved in both of those processes. Well, I love the question, so what? So what? So we have administrators who are involved in policy formulation, and we really don't see that in the private sector. Well, so what? The more you involve public administrators in policy formulation, the more technical your policies tend to become. Because these administrators, they are the ones who are experts in this policy area. So when they lend their expertise to policy formulation, they are going to be putting in that jargon. They're going to be putting in those types of details that perhaps would not otherwise be there because they have the specialized competence to be able to do that. So our policies that emerge once we have public administrators involved in formulation tend to be much more technical, much more specific policies than we otherwise would have. Also, the more you involve public administrators, the more you are involving members of the executive branch. Because remember, at the executive branch, all these public organizations, these federal agencies, and these departments, they are executive organizations. They're part of the executive branch. So, whenever you involve these public administrators from these executive organizations, you are expanding the role of the chief executive, because the chief executive, whether it be the president or the governor, they are the ones who are ultimately responsible for the direct oversight of what those agencies are doing. So sometimes by involving public administrators, you actually enhance the power of the chief executive, sometimes to the detriment of the legislative body. So I think we've established that there are similarities between public and private sectors, but there are also some differences. And the big difference is in how these functions are then carried out. So the whole reason that we talk about these differences between public and private organizations is to help us further understand this idea of the study of public administration and the ability to study public administration as a separate field of study. The more distinct public and private organizations are, the more rationale there is for the study of public administration and not just folding it within the study of private or business administration. And now, admittedly, there are some programs around the country that have folded them together. Several years ago, I was on the accreditation commission for our accrediting body. And one of the programs that came to us for accreditation was a program that actually had merged their MBA and their MPA program together. And so they were a merged program. They would admit people to this one unified program. And then every year they would have a series of case studies that students would do. One year, the case studies would be involving private corporations. The next year would be involving public organizations. And they made the argument that this was a joint administrative degree that could work equally well in either the public or the private sector. So there are some programs, very few, but there are some accredited programs who do kind of take that merging type of an approach. But for the most part, most public affairs education is being done in a separate public administration program that is separate and distinct from an MBA program. So where do we get this idea of a separate study of public administration? It dates all the way back to 1887 in this very famous article by Woodrow Wilson. And we need to preface this in terms of when we talk about Woodrow Wilson, we are doing it with the recognition of all the flaws that come along with a discussion of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a historian, which is not a flaw, but he was a historian, became president of Princeton University, and then ended up becoming president of the United States. We have come to realize, looking back in time, that Wilson has some pretty unsavory views when it came to race relations, and certainly made those very clear when he was president in the White House. So much so that some schools have removed Woodrow Wilson's name from their buildings and their programs. At Princeton University, they have the Wilson School, but they have actually removed the name Woodrow Wilson from the building. And so the building is no longer the Woodrow Wilson Hall. It's now a different name. And so I think we have to recognize that when we talk about Woodrow Wilson. So we're not really extolling the virtues of the person, but rather we're recognizing the contribution that his writings made to the study of public administration. Now, for next week, you'll be reading this Woodrow Wilson article called The Study of Administration that was published back in 1887. So tonight we're going to foreshadow it, then you'll have a chance to read it, and then we can fill in any gaps next week when we meet again. But the idea behind the study of administration by Woodrow Wilson is that if we could study administration as a neutral instrument that is distinct from politics, we could then do a better job and a more efficient job of doing what he referred to as the quote unquote business of government. So he basically made the argument that there are two aspects of government. There's the politics of government, which is where the policies are made by elected officials. And then there is the business of government, which is the execution of those policies by public administrators. So he introduces to us this idea of this politics administration dichotomy that we'd also mentioned last week. Politics administration dichotomy: administrators play on the administrative side, politicians play on the political side. One of the big advantages, according to Wilson, with creating this politics administration dichotomy is that in this dichotomy, if we can pull administration out of politics, what we can then do is we can create this field of study of benign administration, neutral administration. And so he said, once we do that, we can borrow administrative innovations from other countries and we can bring them to America and we can apply them to our administrative system. Once you remove the politics, you can then borrow another country's administrative innovations. So, an example of that is civil service. So, England had a system of civil service that had been in place for many years before we developed it here in the United States. Our system of career civil service really came about at the national level as a result of the Pendleton Act, which was passed in 1883, 4 years before Wilson published his article. But for decades before that in England, there was the British civil service system. In the British civil service system, they were hiring people based upon their merit. They were hiring people based upon their qualifications. However, the way in which they were doing it is they used things such as a closed system of examinations. So people would sit for an examination, and that examination would then test their knowledge, skills, and abilities. And then those who performed well on those examinations, they would then be hired to work in the British civil service. But not everyone was allowed to take those examinations. Those examinations were closed. They were only offered to certain people. So it was a closed system of examinations. Wilson felt that we could utilize that system of examinations, but to use it in our country, we would have to have a more open system of examinations. We had a bit more of an open political culture than what was going on in England at the time. So he said, if we pull out administration as a separate field of study, we can then borrow these examinations and we can use them here in our system of public administration, but they will be open examinations. Another example is the British civil service system. If you wanted to go into the British civil service system from the private sector, you had to start at the bottom and work your way up. So you could be a very top level manager in a private corporation. If you decide for altruistic reasons you want to serve the public interest, you want to go into the career civil service, you would have to go all the way to the bottom of the system and then work your way up. There was no lateral entry. Well, again, because of our more open political culture, Wilson argued that we needed to have lateral entry. We needed to have leaders in the private sector who could then enter the public sector at the same management or leadership level that they were at in the private sector. So we created lateral entry when we took the British system and applied it to our system here in America. And you can do that, according to Wilson, when you are able to separate out administration from politics. But a lot of people, when they talk about the Wilson article, really overemphasize this politics administration dichotomy. There is a line in the article when you read it where Wilson says that politics are the touchstone of administration. When he says politics are the touchstone of administration, what he is saying is that, yes, we can borrow examinations, but we have to change those exams to make them meet our unique political culture. Yes, we can have a mechanism for people that join the civil service from the private sector, but we have to modify that to make it match our unique American, more open political culture. And so, even though he presented this dichotomy, politics are still important because they will have an impact upon how we apply these innovations from other countries. Modern students of public administration reject this idea that we can separate politics and administration because we have seen, like we talked about on the previous screen, that administrators are very much engaged in policy formulation. They very much play in that political world as well as the administrative world. The key point in public administration is even though sometimes policymakers and public administrators are doing similar types of things, they have different types of motivations. For a politician, for an elected official, the primary motivation is obviously to get reelected. Hopefully, for a public administrator, the primary motivation is to make good policy, as Richard Fenna would say, to make good policy that will have a positive, lasting impact upon the people who are affected by that policy. So even though what they're doing may be similar, the motivations for doing it will be different between elected officials and public administrators. But just this idea that we can study administration as a separate field of study really provided the impetus for the idea of creating this field of the study of public administration. And so John Gauss and others who we mentioned last week kind of picked up the torch and helped to create the American Society for Public Administration and to create this study of public administration as a separate field. In terms of the study of public administration, there are some generalizations that we can make about studying public organizations. One generalization about the study of public administration is that public administration is timeless, yet it is time bound. Well, that sounds nice, but what does that mean? It means that there are some maxims, there are some theories of administration that are as true today as they were when they were developed in the late 1800s. So there are some aspects of public administration that are certainly timeless. Things such as the more you value your employees, the more you talk to your employees, the more motivated your employees will be. That's a basic maximum public administration. That's kind of a timeless maxim. However, a lot of these maxims are also time bound, in that next week, when we look at the theories that have been developed in the field of public administration, we will see that those theories are very much an artifact of their time. So we look at the classical theorists like Max Weber and Frederick Taylor and Luther Gulick, Henri Fayol. We'll see a lot of those classical theorists. They were writing in the late 1800s, the early 1900s. They're writing at a point of time that really does explain why they developed the theories that they developed. More modern theories like organization culture, they really do feed more into the more modern theories of the understanding of human beings and what motivates human beings. And so that's why I mean it's time bound. These theories are really artifacts of the time in which they were written. Public administration is universal, but it's also culture bound and varies according to the situation. Again, there are some universal maxims of public administration, but we also have to take into account the culture and the context of the situation that we are dealing with. Every organization has its own organization culture, and we have to keep that culture in mind when we're applying these quote unquote universal theories. And then third, public administration is complex, but it's only intelligible through simplified modeling and step-by-step combining of models. What this means is that the world of public administration is a very complex world. Woodrow Wilson told us that in 1887. It's far more complex today than Woodrow Wilson ever could have imagined back in the late 1800s. But in order to understand a complex world, we need to develop theories and models, simplified into theories and models so that we can understand that complexity. That is the heart of an academic discipline. Academic disciplines develop their own unique theories and models to help explain complex phenomena. And that is something that we certainly do here in the field of public administration. So why is public administration so complex? We'll get to that after the break. So it's 5:20. I think it's probably a good time for us to take our evening break. Let's go ahead and take a break until, let's say 5:35. Come back at 5:35, and then we'll get into some of these reasons why public administration is so complex. And then we'll move into a discussion of public administration as a discipline. We'll talk about what are the characteristics of an academic discipline and then assess public administration to see whether or not it consists of those types of requirements. So take 15 minutes, come on back at 5:35, and we'll get into more of a discussion of complexity. Okay, it's 5:35, so we are back to finish it up tonight. Let's pick up where we left off, talking about the complexity of public administration as, again, a basis for then making the argument as to whether or not public administration is truly a standalone academic discipline. So as we said, public administration is very complex. Organizational systems are complex. We have a lot of governing networks going on. We have different organizations working together in networks to produce and provide different types of goods and services to citizens. Because of all those networks, because of all that cooperation complexity, you can't just have one single model. You need to have multiple theories and multiple models to try and explain that complexity. And that's basically what a lot of these academic disciplines do is they develop these models to try and explain complex phenomena. So what then makes public administration so complex? What are some of the complicating factors in public administration? One of those complicating factors we've already talked about, and that's this interconnection between policy making and execution or implementation. There is so much overlap between formulation and implementation that it does make things complex and confusing. Who does what? Who's responsible for what role? How much should administrators be involved in policy formulation? How much should elected officials be involved in implementation? Anytime you have that type of overlap, you're going to have a lot of complexity. The need for coordination, as I just mentioned, with governing networks. Agencies need to coordinate not just with other agencies, but also with nonprofit organizations. They need to cooperate with private sector organizations for the delivery of these goods and these services. There is a distinction between the terms provision and production. So oftentimes we kind of confuse those terms and we use them interchangeably, but there is a difference between providing a good and producing that good. The distinction is provision is giving the resources that will then make the production possible. So provision is providing, giving the resources. Production is then actually creating this good or this service. So when you think about provision, provision is the tuition that you pay, the fees that you pay, the appropriations that are given to the university by the Cal State system. Those are the resources. That's the provision of MPA education. The production of MPA education is then what goes on here in this class tonight and in all the other courses that you're taking in the MPA program. Whenever you have provision production, sometimes provision's done by the public sector and production's done by the private sector. Sometimes the public sector can do both provision as well as production. Sometimes the private sector does both provision and production. Sometimes, in some rare occurrences, the private sector does the provision and the public sector does the production. So you have a lot of different types of arrangements in terms of provision and production of goods and services that requires a whole lot of that type of coordination. And to not digress too much on this point, what are the ways to determine whether it should be public or private sector engaging in the provision and production of goods and services? We have to look at what type of good or service is being created. And there are essentially 4 different types of goods that can be created. One type of good is what's called a pure private good. Excuse me, I already sneezed. Sorry about that. Excuse me. Sorry. Is a pure private good. A pure private good is something that is provided as well as produced by the private sector. So you think about something like a candy bar that you purchase in a store. That candy bar, the resources that go into making that candy bar are going to come from the private corporation that is making that candy bar. Those resources are probably going to be from profits from earlier candy bars that were sold. So provision is a private sector type of responsibility with a pure private good. Production, the actual making of that candy bar, is done in the factory by that private corporation. That's a purely private type of enterprise. Now, admittedly, there can be some government regulation of that production process where government can come in and say, you can't use this type of ingredient that's unsafe to society, or you have to abide by these OSHA requirements in terms of the safety of your workplace. So there can be some government regulation, but for the most part, that production process is being done by the private sector. So in a pure private good, you tend to have private provision and private production. In a pure private goods are what we consider to be exhaustible and excludable. They're exhaustible in that they can be used up. So if there's one candy bar left on the shelf and you have two people going after that candy bar, the person who gets there first is going to get the candy bar. That candy bar is then gone. It's then been exhausted for that other person who's in the store. So it is exhaustible. It's also excludable in that you're charging a price for that candy bar. So if you and I go in to purchase that candy bar that costs 75 cents, I only have 50 cents. I can't purchase the candy bar. I'm excluded from purchasing and consuming that candy bar. That's a pure private good. That's a pretty simple type of production process and provision process. There's not a whole lot of coordination that goes on there. The opposite end of the spectrum is what we call a pure public good. A pure public good is just the complete opposite of a pure private good. It is non-excludable and it's also non-exhaustible. It cannot be used up and you cannot exclude people who do not pay for it. So you have a lot of free riders, as economists would say. So the classic example of a pure public good is national defense. Granted, we do have contractors who will create all these different implements of war, whether it be a missile or it be a tank or airplane, but the actual overall provision and production of national defense is the government's responsibility. It is non-exhaustible in that me getting a benefit from national defense doesn't use up the benefit, so you don't get a benefit. So it's non-exhaustible, and it's also non-excludable in that you don't pay a fee necessarily for national defense. Now, granted, national defense ends up being paid for through tax revenue, but you don't have a fee attached to the benefit you're getting from national defense. So if you got very much of a public-public type of relationship there, there's not as much coordination. Certainly there's coordination between public entities, but sometimes it's a little bit less challenging than coordination between public and private entities. So you've got pure private goods versus pure public goods. Where we run into a lot of complexity with coordination is when we get into the gray area between those two different types of goods. And in that gray area, we have two additional goods. One type of good is what's called a toll good, and the other good is called a collective pool good. I can type. I put those in text yet. So a toll good and a collective pool good. In a toll goods are excludable, but they are non-exhaustible. They cannot be used up, but you can exclude someone. So the classic example would be something like a toll road. You drive up to that toll road, the arm is down, you put your money in, as we did in the old days. Now I guess you have a transponder, but in the old days, you throw the money into the basket, the bar goes up, and you can then drive on the toll road. You drive up there, you don't have the money, the bar doesn't go up, you can't drive on the toll road. So it is excludable, but technically it's not exhaustible in that everyone who pays will eventually have an opportunity to drive on that road. So that's what's called a toll good. Then you have collective pool goods. And collective pool goods are the opposite of toll goods. So in a collective pool good, you have something that is non-excludable, but it can be exhausted. So things like natural resources, rights to mineral pools, those types of things that we call collective pool goods. When we get into that gray area with toll goods and collective pool goods, that's where we introduce a lot of complexity. Oops. I don't know why that moved forward, but that's why we introduce a lot of complexity. Go back there. Because you have so much coordination necessary. If you've got the private sector that is producing and the public sector that is providing, you've got a lot of relationships that are going on between those different entities in different sectors of the economy. So you think about something like privatization. So when government decides to privatize, they oftentimes do that through government provision and then private sector production. So if you're going to, like in one of our scenarios on the assessment, if you're going to construct a school, so that public entity, that school district is going to construct a school, they're not going to use their own employees to construct that school. They are going to put out a request for proposal, an RFP, and then private sector contractors will then bid on that RFP. And then the lowest responsive bid will then be selected as the contractor to construct that school. That type of a competitive bidding process, that's the example of the public sector providing, because the public sector pays for that contract, but then the actual production, the actual creation of that school, that's being left to that private sector contractor. So you've got this relationship and sometimes very complex coordination going on between the school district and that contractor. And having lived through on the school board through many capital projects, I'll tell you there's a whole lot of coordination that is required. And sometimes the coordination doesn't work out. And then you end up in legal proceedings in case the contractor did not meet all the requirements of building that school. You're probably going to end up in legal proceedings. If one of the contractors that submitted a bid in the public contracting process feels that the bid was not awarded according to public contract code, then they can always appeal that and grieve the awarding of that contract. So there's a lot of complexity in the coordination between public and private sector organizations. In these complex relationships, we then have a lot of power that is being exercised. As we had discussed when we talked about power, there are different types of power. Power is multidimensional, but the different types of power that you have being exercised and different ways in which that power is being exercised, the more complexity you will have as well. Public administration is also doing what we call floating in the seas of time, which basically means that it is time bound, in that the most appropriate way to approach an issue today may not have been the most appropriate way to approach the issue in the 1960s or in the 1920s or in the 1880s. So it really does depend upon the context of the situation. You have different hierarchical structures in the public sector as well. Some hierarchical structures are very much top down, like a lot of our older, more rigid types of organizations, where you have this very hierarchical, tall hierarchy, this pyramid shape to your organization, where you have one person in charge, and as you move down the organization chart, you encounter more and more employees. Some of our organizations are much more bottom up in nature, in that they're a much flatter type of hierarchy whereby everyone has the opportunity to participate in decision making within that organization. That's usually common in our smaller organizations, especially in smaller nonprofit types of organizations. So you got complexity when you have these different types of organization structures. There's a lot of complexity that comes from the world of information, and it's getting even more complex with each passing day. Where you get information from, how you consider information to be credible and verified information, that's very important in public administration. We want to base our decisions on credible, verified information. As you move through your MPA program, you will talk more and more about peer review and the importance of using peer-reviewed data and peer-reviewed articles to inform your research. Their information is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. Now we have the added layer in information in terms of things like generative AI and how generative AI is used in public administration. I firmly believe, as I told you in our first night class, I think generative AI is going to be a major element of public administration in the future. That's why I would like to see MPA programs embrace it as opposed to just saying, well, you're not allowed to use it at all. And this is the whole landscape of information is changing and will continue to change. Again, adding a lot more complexity. Some of our organizations are very centralized organizations in that they have one headquarters and everyone works in that organization, that headquarters. Some of our organizations are much more dispersed across the country where they will have field and regional offices. You think about an example like the Department of Agriculture. Department of Agriculture, even though it has a headquarters in Washington, D.C., will have field and regional offices spread across the entire country in the vast majority of states, and some states will have multiple field offices within them. That's a much more disaggregated, decentralized type of structure, which adds a lot of complexity to managing that organization. Post-COVID-19, if there is such a thing as being post-COVID-19, we have a lot more hybrid work arrangements, a lot more remote work, introduces even more complexity to the field of public administration. And there are a lot of great new articles that have come out over the past year looking at leading organizations in a remote environment. And how do you motivate employees when they are located hundreds of miles away? How do you build teamwork and this esprit de corps among your employees when everyone's working in a different remote area? How do you hold people accountable for doing the work they're supposed to do when they are not located in one physical type of location? And so the more remote work we have, the more complexity we're going to have in how we study public organizations. And then finally, what we had talked about last week, the values of public administration. As we know that there are more values that we try to adhere to in public administration than oftentimes what we see in the private sector. The more values you have, the more potential that those values can come into conflict with each other. The more conflict you have between values, the more complex it becomes in making our decisions. So I think it's pretty clear that studying public administration is a very complex endeavor. It is such a complex endeavor that we can't really explain it with abstract theories. We have to develop specific models that will help us understand how to match organizations in specific contextual situations. But it's also too complex for us to settle on one single model or one single theory. And when we manage our organizations, we're going to be doing it through the combination of multiple models and multiple theories, which means if we want to study organizations, we need to have the capacity to develop these multiple models and multiple theories. When you're developing multiple models and multiple theories, you're essentially doing the work of an academic discipline. So we know that at any university, you'll have multiple disciplines across the university. You'll have history departments and political science and economics and sociology and all these different academic disciplines. The question then for us is, why do we have all these separate academic disciplines? What makes something an academic discipline? What are the elements of an academic discipline? And I think one element of an academic discipline is what we just talked about, the need to develop unique theories to understand phenomena within our disciplinary area. So we develop different theories in political science than we develop in the world of sociology. We develop different things in the world of business, different theories in the world of business than we'll develop in the world of engineering. So an academic discipline typically develops unique theories to understand the complex phenomena within that area. Also, academic disciplines have uniqueness to them in that the types of things that we are studying, the types of phenomena that we are studying, are distinct and different than the phenomena being studied in other academic disciplines. Just like we had talked about earlier tonight with the difference between public and private administration and the study of public and private sector. What we are doing is somewhat similar. It's how we are doing it that is so different. And since what we are doing is different, it suggests for us a unique and different way of studying that phenomena. So the phenomena we study is relatively unique. And then the methodologies we use are also relatively unique as well. So we'll use methodologies that are different than the methodologies to collect data and analyze data that are used in other academic disciplines. So essentially with an academic discipline, we develop unique theories to understand phenomena. The phenomena we are studying is relatively unique, and the methods we use to study that phenomena tend to be relatively unique as well. The problem for us here in public administration in trying to answer the question of whether or not the study of public administration demonstrates these elements is that public administration is very interdisciplinary in nature. For proof of that, all you have to do is take a look at the faculty who teach in our MPA program here at Cal State Long Beach. In our MPA program, we have, and we've had some retirements, but we essentially have had 3 political scientists among our faculty. We've had 2 people with their doctorates in public administration. We used to have someone with a doctorate in economics. We have someone with a doctorate in organization, behavior, and leadership. So we have four different quote unquote academic disciplines all represented within the faculty in our MPA program. And just underscore that point again, when the last time when I was department chair, we went out and hired a full-time tenure track faculty member. When the college approved the position announcement, they approved it as someone with a PhD in public administration. And I had to go back and say, well, we've got an interdisciplinary faculty. And so really, it should be public administration, political science, or other related fields. And we had to get them to change that description because we have so many people from other academic disciplines on our faculty. You think about, all of you as students in the program, you all oftentimes come from very different academic backgrounds and different undergraduate majors. And so I think that's good evidence that we are very multidisciplinary. Another piece of evidence of how multidisciplinary we are is all the different administrative arrangements for MPA programs that you see across the country. I'm going on a site visit in a couple of weeks to an MPA program, do accreditation site visit, and their MPA program is housed within a department of politics. A lot of MPA programs a department of political science. In that public administration is viewed as being a subfield within the discipline of political science. However, other MPA programs are located within a college of business, and it's just one additional program in a bigger college of business. We are located in a College of Health and Human Services here at Cal State Long Beach, which is admittedly a relatively unique arrangement. I think there are only two other programs across the country that are in a College of Health and Human Services, but that's a completely different arrangement than what you see with the majority of MPA programs. There are some MPA programs that are housed together with health sciences and healthcare administration. So since you have all these different administrative arrangements, again, it emphasizes just how multidisciplinary public administration is. When you're as multidisciplinary as we are in public administration, sometimes it makes it challenging for us to answer that question, are we a standalone academic discipline? You don't have to answer that question tonight. Fortunately, you won't have to answer that question until after class next week. Next week, we're going to get into a discussion of all these theories that have developed within the field of public administration. And one of the things that you will see is that a lot of these theories come from outside of public administration. In fact, some of the theories predate Wilson's article in 1887 about public administration as an academic area of study. Some of our theories come from the world of sociology. Some come from the world of business. Some come from the world of psychology. Some even come from the world of physics. And I'll introduce you to a theory next week that comes from the world of physics. So we borrow theories from a variety of other academic disciplines rather than always generating our own. So we'll borrow theories from other academic disciplines. We will then modify and change those theories to make them match the study of public organizations. We'll even talk next week about a theory that comes from the world of biology. And so we really do borrow from a lot of different academic disciplines. But we'll talk about all that next week. You'll kind of see how all these theories have been modified and changed in order to make them apply to the study of public administration. But, my favorite question we've talked about a couple of times already tonight is, so what? Well, does it really matter whether or not public administration is an academic discipline or just simply a subfield within a larger discipline such as political science? I think the big difference is in how we study public organizations. So if you're going to locate public administration within a field like political science, you're probably going to take a much more quantitative, statistically inclined approach to studying public organizations, because that's essentially what the science in political science means. If, however, you're going to co-locate public administration in a department of history, then you're going to take a much more qualitative approach to studying those organizations. It won't be as much numbers based as will be based upon people's perceptions and behaviors and why they act the way they do. So it does make a difference whether or not you think it is a standalone discipline or whether or not you think it is part of another academic discipline. I just kind of want to foreshadow that information here tonight. And then next week, when we talk about these theoretical perspectives, Then after we've discussed those theoretical perspectives, then in both Canvas essay number 4, as well as question number 4, scenario number 4 in your midterm assessment, you will talk about whether or not you think public administration is an academic discipline, and then provide some justification for why you believe it either is an academic discipline or just a subfield within another larger discipline like political science. But the whole purpose for this discussion, the discussion we're going to have next week, is again to get at the point of why are you here? Why are you in an MPA program? Or why are you taking an MPA course? What's the purpose of being here? And the purpose of being here is to learn how to study public organizations. And that's what this entire course is really all about. That kind of covers everything that I was planning on speaking about tonight. Again, next week, we'll get into a discussion of these theoretical perspectives on public administration. And also, if time permits next week, we will also then start talking a little bit about decision making and talking about how we can measure effectiveness of public organizations as well. But at this point, what I would kind of like to do is I kind of like to do some breakout groups for a few minutes. We did that last week with Kelly. I kind of like doing that in a lot of the 500 courses so you can kind of get to know each other a little bit better and get to work with each other. So what I thought we would do for maybe about 20 minutes or so is I'll break you up into some breakout groups. And there are only 10 of us here tonight. So we will probably only do 2 breakout groups. So let me go ahead and start setting those up. And then I'll tell you what the task is. So I think we're probably fine just creating 2 breakout groups. And there'll be 2 breakout groups with 5 people in each one. And the purpose of the breakout group is, as a group, I'd like for you to select a public organization. It doesn't have to be your own, but select a public organization and then start thinking about some of the differences between your organization that you selected and a private sector organization. And so we're going to kind of do what you're going to be doing on your Canvas essay. So if you could, as a group, select an organization, agree upon an organization to talk about, and then come up with 2 similarities and 2 differences between that organization and a private sector organization. And then we'll do that for, like I said, about 20 minutes or so. Then we'll reconvene as a class. We'll see what both of the groups came up with. And then I think at that point, we'll be able to call it a night. So I've created 2 groups. And so we have room number 1, Cheyenne, Caitlin, my glasses on, Karen, Lauren, Natalia. Group number 2, we have Alice, Alma, Andrea, Samantha, and Sean. So I'm going to open up the rooms so you can go on into your breakout rooms. Like I said, about 20 minutes, and then we'll reconvene as a class. So the rooms are open, so feel free to migrate into your assigned breakout room.